I walked into the conference room balancing two large brown paper bags, the kind that crinkle when you shift them. Inside, still warm, was lunch for 12 thick sandwiches, fresh salads, and perfectly golden fries. The aroma filled the air before I even set them down. "Wow, Emily," one of my colleagues chuckled. "You really went all out. What's this, a pity lunch?" A few others laughed. I smiled, letting them. It wasn't the first time I'd been the punchline in this room. Most of them still thought of me as the girl who used to bring leftovers from home because I couldn't afford the cafeteria. I smoothed my silk blouse, pale cream, the kind that feels cool against your skin, and slid into my chair. Outside the window, the Manhattan skyline shimmered in the midday sun. My phone buzzed beside me, screen lighting up with a message. "Shipment arrived at Dallas location. Need your approval." I tilted the screen away before anyone could read it. They passed the bags around, pulling out sandwiches wrapped in parchment. "Where's this from?" someone asked between bites. I just shrugged. "A little place I know." If only they knew the truth. If only they realized the little place was mine. All of them were laughing, eating, talking, completely unaware that every bite they took was from a restaurant chain I built from the ground up. And today, for the first time, I was ready to let them find 3 years earlier. I was standing in the cramped break room of the same company, clutching a plastic container of homemade pasta. It wasn't fancy, just penne tossed with marinara, sprinkled with Parmesan from a jar. But it was what I could afford. I remember the way Rebecca, my team lead back then, wrinkled her nose. "Still bringing food from home, Emily? You should treat yourself once in a while." Her voice dripped with that fake concern people use when they're really just mocking you. A couple of others smirked. One of them whispered something I couldn't quite catch, but the laughter that followed burned enough. I kept my head down, stabbing at the pasta with a plastic fork, telling myself it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered so much I could barely swallow. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck, juggling rent on my shoebox apartment in Queens, student loans, and a car payment. Eating out wasn't in the budget. What they didn't know was that cooking wasn't just survival for me. It was the one thing that made me feel capable when the rest of my life felt like it was slipping through my fingers. That night, I called my grandmother, Eleanor. She'd been a diner waitress for 35 years, raising 3 kids on tips and grit. "They laughed at me again," I said, voice shaking. "Let them laugh," she replied. "People laughed at me when I said I'd send all my kids to college. Guess where they graduated from?" I could hear the clink of dishes in the background, the hum of the diner she still worked in. She told me something I'd never forgotten. The world doesn't always see your worth right away. Sometimes, you have to build something so undeniable, they can't ignore it, and by the time they notice, you'll be the one deciding if they belong in your life. Before we hung up, she handed me a gift, mailed it the next day. A battered leather-bound recipe book, the pages worn thin, with her handwriting filling every margin. "For when you're ready," the note read. I didn't know it then, but that recipe book would be the seed of everything I'd build. The laughter in that break room had humiliated me, but it also lit the first spark. And once I decided I wasn't going to be the joke anymore, there was no going back. I started small, painfully small. On weekends, I cooked from my tiny apartment kitchen, taking catering orders from Craigslist and a handful of friends. My grandmother's recipes were my blueprint, but I put my own spin on them. Garlic aioli instead of plain mayo, fresh basil instead of dried flakes. Every dollar I made went back into the business. Better ingredients, sturdier containers, a secondhand mixer from a restaurant supply auction. The first time I made more in a weekend than I did in an entire week in my office job, I cried in the middle of my kitchen. Not because I'd made it, I hadn't, but because for the first time, it felt possible. Then I met Michael Lawson, the owner of a small but beloved bistro in Brooklyn. He'd ordered my catering for a charity event and pulled me aside afterward. "You've got something here," he said, "but you need a bigger stage." He became my unofficial mentor, teaching me about supplier contracts, staff training, health inspections, even the brutal math of profit margins. Michael never treated me like a charity case. He treated me like a peer in training, and that made all the difference. The road was brutal. There were nights I came home so exhausted I fell asleep in my apron. Days when orders were wrong, deliveries were late, or customers complained because their fries weren't crispy enough. I fought self-doubt, sexism from vendors who tried to lowball me, and the ever-present fear that one bad month could end it all. But there were wins, too. My first real break came when a local food critic wrote about my signature chicken pesto melt, a recipe straight from my grandmother's book. Suddenly, people were lining up outside the little cafe I'd scraped together enough to rent. That cafe became my proof of concept. Within a year, I had 3 locations. Within 2, I had 9. The day I signed the paperwork to acquire a struggling regional restaurant chain and rebrand it under my name, I didn't tell a soul at work. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted my success to be mine alone, not something they could claim to have seen coming. On social media, I kept things vague. A smiling picture here, a latte art photo there. Nothing that revealed the scale of what I was building. Even my LinkedIn still listed my old corporate job. I wanted to protect the business from unnecessary gossip, and if I was honest, I wanted to choose my moment. Because I knew the day would come when the same people who once smirked at my homemade pasta would have to see me for who I'd become. And that day was closer than they thought. Back in the conference room, the smell of the food had everyone leaning in for seconds. The sandwiches were gone in minutes, the salads nearly empty, the fries down to a few lonely scraps. "This is incredible," Mark from finance said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "What's the name of this place?" "I'm taking my wife there this weekend." I took a slow sip of water, letting the moment stretch. "Oh, you've probably seen it around," I said lightly. Rebecca, yes, the same Rebecca who once made a sport out of teasing me, was scrolling on her phone. "Is this from Harvest Table? The packaging looks just like theirs." "Yeah, it is," I replied. "Oh my God, I love them," she said. "They're everywhere now. Whoever runs that chain is a genius." She popped another fry in her mouth and laughed. "Bet they're making a fortune." That was my cue. I folded my hands on the table. "They are." "I would know." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" I looked around the room. The same faces that had once pitted me, underestimated me, laughed at me. "I mean," I said, my voice calm but steady, "I own it. Every location, every recipe, every fry you just ate came from my kitchen, or at least the one I built." The room went silent. Mark froze with his coffee halfway to his lips. Rebecca actually stopped chewing. Someone dropped a pen, the clatter loud in the stillness. "You own Harvest Table?" Mark asked slowly, as if saying it out loud might make more sense. "All 9 locations," I confirmed. "And we're opening our 10th in Chicago next month." Rebecca's face went pale. "But I thought you were still the girl bringing leftovers from home?" I said, smiling. "Yeah, that was me. And honestly, it's still me in a way. I just have a few more kitchens now." I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, turning the screen toward them. A message thread from my operations manager was open. Updates on the Dallas grand opening, projected Q3 numbers, and a photo of our newest restaurant's ribbon-cutting ceremony. My name was on every contract, every permit, every menu. The shock in their eyes wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that I'd done it without asking for their approval, without needing their validation. Rebecca shifted in her seat, clearing her throat. "Emily, I had no idea." "That's the thing," I said, leaning back. "You didn't need to know. I didn't build this to prove you wrong. I built it to prove me right." The air in the room felt different now, heavier, charged. No one was laughing anymore. Instead, they were looking at me like I'd been hiding in plain sight all these years, which, in a way, I had. Across the table, Mark finally found his voice. "So, you're like rich? I just smiled. "Let's just say I don't bring lunch because I have to anymore. I bring it because I can." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of awkward politeness. People kept thanking me for lunch, their voices softer now, almost deferential. It was subtle, but the shift was unmistakable. I wasn't the underdog anymore. And they were just starting to realize that the power dynamic had changed. A week later, I invited a smaller group from the office, the same ones who'd been loudest in their past judgment, to lunch at one of my flagship locations in Midtown. Not as customers, as my guests. When they walked in, the hostess greeted me with, "Welcome back, Miss Carter," and led us straight to the best corner table, the one reserved for me. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, glinting off the polished cutlery. Art from local painters lined the walls, a policy I'd insisted on since the beginning. I watched them take it all in. The open kitchen with chefs moving like choreographed dancers, the crisp uniforms, the hum of lunchtime energy. "This is yours?" Mark asked again, still looking like he half expected someone to say it was a prank. "Every inch," I replied. Once we ordered, I decided it was time to speak plainly. "Look, I didn't bring you here to rub it in. But I also didn't build all this to forget where I came from. You asked me the other day if I'd help with a few career connections, right?" I looked at Rebecca, who nodded hesitantly. "I'm open to helping. But there are conditions." They leaned in, waiting. "First," I said, "you stop underestimating people because of where they are right now. Everyone starts somewhere. Second, if you want my help, whether it's a job referral, an introduction, or business advice, you show up prepared. No excuses, no coasting. And third," I let my gaze settle on Rebecca, "you treat every person in the room like they could own the building you're standing in. Because sometimes they do." They were quiet for a moment. The clatter of plates from the kitchen filled the space between us. Rebecca finally spoke. "That's fair." She glanced down at her hands. "I think I owe you an apology. For back then." "You don't owe me an apology," I said, my tone softer. "You owe yourself a better way of moving through the world. If you learn that, then maybe all those years of being underestimated were worth it." It wasn't about revenge. It was about rewriting the terms of how they, and maybe others, would treat the next Emily Carter they crossed paths with. When the check came, the server placed it in front of me. I signed without looking at the total. Rebecca's eyes widened when she caught a glimpse of the figure. Money had stopped being the point a long time ago. Power wasn't about making people feel small, it was about choosing when to lift them up. And right now, I was giving them the choice to rise, or stay exactly where they were. Over the next few months, I began to notice small changes. Rebecca sent me an email one morning, not to ask for a favor, but to share that she'd enrolled in a culinary management course at NYU. "Figured it was time to stop just talking about doing something," she wrote. Mark started volunteering at a local food pantry on weekends. He sent me a photo of himself in an apron, ladling soup into a bowl, with the caption, "Not as easy as it looks, Carter." None of this erased the years of dismissive comments or quiet mockery, but it proved something important. Change is possible if someone is willing to see themselves honestly. One evening, after closing time, I stood alone in my Midtown flagship. The lights were dim, the last staff member had gone home, and the city outside was awash in that golden haze between day and night. I unlocked my office drawer and pulled out the battered leather recipe book my grandmother had given me. The edges were frayed, the ink faded in places, but it was still the heart of everything I'd built. I flipped to the page for Eleanor's chicken pesto melt, the recipe that had sparked my first write-up in the paper, the one that had started the chain reaction. I ran my fingers over her handwriting and smiled. I wished she were here to see this. The dining rooms full of laughter, the kitchens buzzing with life, the employees who'd found steady work and pride in what they did. Her words came back to me as clear as the day she'd said them. The world doesn't always see your worth right away. Sometimes you have to build something so undeniable, they can't ignore it. Outside, a couple strolled past the front windows, pausing to look at the menu posted near the door. The woman smiled, pointing at something on the list. They didn't know me. They didn't know my story. And that was fine. Because the truth wasn't for everyone. It was for the people who laughed when I brought lunch. And for me, the woman who turned that laughter into a legacy. I closed the recipe book, locked it away, and switched off the office light. Walking through the empty dining room, I let my heels click against the hardwood floor, each step a reminder of how far I'd come. And as the door closed behind me, I left with one thought in my head, steady and certain. Never underestimate the quiet ones.